How y'all doing? Good, excellent. Late in the day. So, yeah, I'm hoping we can maybe take a moment to go back in time. So let's hop into our time machine. Oh, wait, I went back too far. Okay, let's try this again. Let's hop back into the time machine. The year is 2003. In 2003, the Wired redesign had come out just the year before. So Doug Bowman, had a lot of popularity from this. Mike Davidson had worked on the ESPN redesign. It was at this point that CSS, as a thing that we could use, became reality. And this was a pretty exciting time. Having done web development for years at this point and realizing that this easier, better way of approaching things was possible. The thing is that for me personally, my world was still pretty much blogs. And when I looked to what all my friends were doing, looking at all the other people that were building out websites, a lot of us were still building out blog designs. And the kind of things that we have to deal with when we're building out that kind of stuff is definitely different than the stuff that we have to worry about at scale. The thing with blog designs is that we tend to only have to worry about a very small number of things. My CSS to this day is 11K. That's a fairly small file. That can compress down really small. And if I'm dealing with 116 rules, that's not a complicated website. Now with that, my website hasn't changed in 5 years. The site that I've built and designed hasn't really changed that much. And with all these kind of blog style designs where we're dealing with like a home page, an inside page, this is a fairly straightforward thing to build. Eric Meyer's website at 19K, still fairly manageable. We're looking at a couple hundred rules, really easy to understand everything that is going on with our systems. The way we code for a site like this, certainly the way I looked at the way a site was built was, okay, I've got this thing. I've got a header, I've got a sidebar, I've got a footer. Let me style every single HTML element that I have in a way that I can expect. And that's a really easy system to build within. But you might have noticed this little bit of code in that last example. There's a lot of CSS, even just in these two simple rules, which is, considering how simple the blog design is why did I have all this code for what was really just the only thing that I cared about was the author name and the comment number. How many authors did I have on my website that I needed to really be that specific to say, yes, it had to be in the meta element. It had to be within the comment element. It had to be within the comments element. I had to have all this HTML to exist in order for this to work. But again, this is my personal blog. I didn't have to work with anybody else. It was fairly straightforward. And then there was a point in time where I decided to get out of freelancing, stop dealing with clients. As much as I love working with clients one-on-one, I would work on a project, deliver it, and move on to the next one. I never had that sense of ownership on the stuff that I was working on. And so I decided to get a job at Yahoo. At Yahoo, I was suddenly dealing with more and more people. I had the designers that I had to work with. I had the developers within Yahoo Mail, the developers within Messenger, Calendar, Address Book, all these different teams that I had to work with. I realized this kind of looks like Star Wars. I may have watched the trailer way too many times already. And once I found myself in this kind of situation, I realized that a lot of the stuff that I had been doing no longer worked well at that scale. I remember when I left Yahoo and came into Shopify, this was the CSS that I came into. They were still doing things the way I used to do things, which was have a single CSS file for everything. So this sort of large, sprawling CSS file, everybody had to manage. And as you might imagine, working with that kind of thing where somebody makes a change somewhere, but then we break something somewhere else, so we try to fix that. And it just becomes this ongoing thing that we have to manage until eventually we kind of get frustrated and want to just get rid of it. There we go. And as much as I would like to, when I came into Yahoo, I was in a blessed situation in that we got to redesign from scratch. Every bit of HTML and CSS that we got to build was from scratch. So when I came into Shopify, I definitely felt like I would have loved to do this to the CSS, right? Just like, let's blow it all away, let's get rid of it and start from the beginning. But instead, what we decided to do was not do that. And now going in, this idea, that long CSS file was pretty much what you would expect. There was sort of this beginning thing, and then on top of all that was all these exceptions. Well, on the discounts page, there's going to be this CSS. On the products page, there's going to be this CSS, and everybody just kind of kept adding to that file. So one of the first things that I wanted to do when I come in here was to identify patterns. The thing is that when we're looking at a web page, it's often hard to sort of understand just how deep and where these sort of things reoccur throughout our entire project. And patterns are important. So within a particular website, any kind of design that I'm doing, any kind of design is going to use patterns as a way of creating predictability, setting expectations. And in that, exceptions will be introduced. Exceptions are important. Exceptions help draw attention to specific things. So that might be done with a change in position. It might be done with a change in color, a change in size, a change in shape. But often as we add these exceptions, we run into a situation where suddenly everything becomes an exception. It becomes difficult to understand the complexity of our code base. And when we're looking at one particular page, it's often hard to see that. So we need a better way to identify and document those patterns. Now, the thing is that if we look at what it is that we're actually trying to do, we are trying to take an HTML element, a div, and we're trying to define it as something. And so we go to our CSS and we need to find some way of saying, what is this element doing? And so we need to give it a name. That name could be an element selector, it could be an ID selector, it could be class selector, but ultimately what we're trying to do is just find some way of categorizing this thing. Right? That I have this HTML element that needs to map to some design that I've actually created and make it look and possibly act in a certain way. So in doing this, I wrote a book, but I'm not here to plug the book. I'm here to talk about some of the things in my workflow, and one of those things is in identifying categories that I can see certain patterns emerge in the categorization. In other words, when I create a layout, to me the layout is the thing that defines width, that has that flexibility, that manages responsive design. Whereas the modules are going to be more discrete. They should expand to fill the layout that they happen to be in. So if they're in a sidebar, they'll be constrained by the layout of the sidebar. If they're in the main content area, they'll be constrained by the layout of the main section. And this allows me to move things around. This allows me to see when a certain pattern might show up that I need to maybe push back on with a particular team. So in that, I've got my base styles. My base styles are my element selectors. Like I want every heading maybe to look a certain way, every paragraph tag to look a certain way. I try to keep this fairly lean. If I start styling my base elements too much, I'm likely going to run into problems down the road. A good example of that, one that we definitely ran into at Shopify, was input selectors. All our inputs should look a certain way. The problem was is that we ended up redesigning the way our inputs should look, but we did that with requiring a more complex HTML structure that needed to go around it. And as a result of that, we couldn't just roll out new input fields by changing a single style. We had to change both the CSS and HTML to go along with that, and therefore we needed to do this incrementally. But having styled the default inputs, we couldn't just easily roll out this new style. Now, on top of that base, we have layout. And this is just the way I tend to envision the things that I build. I'm going to start with that base layer, and then I'm going to start with the containers. And with these containers, I'm going to say that I have this big one up at the top, this big one at the bottom, and maybe a 3-column grid in the middle. Whatever that is, this is my layout. These are the containers. I'm not thinking about the actual content necessarily that's going in them. I'm just creating the structure for everything to go into. And the modules are really the meat of the page. So these are things like your tabs and your buttons, all these individual pieces. On top of that is theming. Now theming, when people think of theming, they think of anything that has to do with maybe color or drop shadows. But the thing is that CSS is really all about visual state, visual style. And so to me, theming is really anything that is user customizable. In other words, anything that's in the interface that may need to change based on a user setting. So for example, I might have a certain color scheme that I want to change instantly. And so I need some way of isolating those colors out to something else. If I was, let's say, white labeling a product, and I had a new client that needed their own look and feel that was based off the same CSS that I was running, a lot of the theme stuff wouldn't be applicable in sort of this scheme of things. In other words, the CSS that I was writing, the actual compiled CSS that went out to the browser, wouldn't have any theme concepts in it. I may still have a theme file that might be done in Sass, for example, that has all my color variables, so I could customize those color variables, but the actual compiled output wouldn't have any theme classes in there. And then this layer that kind of goes across all of these is state. So I have something in my page that I may need to change the look and feel of. So for example, I might have a button that when I press it, changes to an active state. When I have a carousel that when I click on something, what is that state of, maybe revealing something or hiding something, depending on what kind of animations I might have in there. So, taking a design, this was the Yahoo Mail design that I happened to work on. And, layout, I've got very simple containers. I've got one for content, one for header, and one for sidebar. The modules were the things like the tabs, the customized list view, the buttons. Speaking of buttons, we had things like the dark buttons, the small buttons, the large buttons, the search buttons. There was a lot of buttons. And so, even when you have a module, we have these variations on this module, and we need to really just kind of declare what those differences are. Within a given module, I might have child elements, and I need to be able to associate those child elements with the parent. So in the case of a modal dialog, for example, I might have the modal overlay. I might have the modal header, the modal body, the modal footer. I might have other modules inside that thing, but when I go to style stuff, I'm going to style those separately. I'm not going to link them to a specific context. So if you can imagine, again, going back to our HTML structure, that each of these dots essentially represent an HTML element, that I want some way to isolate these pieces. That I'm going to say, these particular HTML elements belong together. This is going to essentially be my template. And then I'm going to associate some CSS with these specific HTML elements. And so just like I separate these from the elements that came before and the elements that came after, in a lot of cases, I actually want to separate those as well from child elements that might also come contained within that. So kind of going back to the workflow aspect, this categorization of things and this ability to break things down into individual pieces, when we look at the actual CSS that we're writing, we want to do the same thing. So what we do is we take each of those pieces that we've designed, all the CSS, and we're going to put them into their own file. What this means is that when I find something in my code that based on my naming convention, based on the categorization that I have, I know exactly where to find it in my CSS. Now, once I've actually separated everything into individual files, the last thing I want to do is actually create separate link statements linking up each of these files. At this point, is there anybody here that doesn't use a preprocessor now? One person, really? You don't use a preprocessor? Wow. Oddly enough, maybe not so oddly, 3 years ago, when I would ask this question, only a handful of people would put their hand up saying that they used a preprocessor. So it's interesting to see that really within 3 years, our industry has actually changed quite a bit when it comes to CSS development. It's a pretty amazing thing. So I'm sure at this point I don't really have to sell you on the concept of using a preprocessor. Okay, so now that we've broken this stuff down, I wanted to show you this XKCD. I swear there's an XKCD for everything. I'm going to read it out to you in case it's a little bit hard to read on the screen. Mind you, it's actually a little hard to read on my screen. Keep in mind that I'm self-taught, so my code may be a little messy. I'm self-taught, although I kind of have a problem with calling myself self-taught because the industry as a whole in conferences like this teach me a ton. I like to say I'm self-directed. But yeah, I'm self-directed, I'm self-taught, so my code might be a little messy. And so this guy says to this woman that, okay, can you check this out? And she says, let me see, I'm sure it's fine. Wow, this is like being in a house built by a child using nothing but a hatchet and a picture of a house. It's like a salad recipe written by a corporate lawyer using a phone autocorrect that only knew Excel formulas. It's like someone took a transcript of a couple arguing at IKEA and made random edits until it compiled without errors. To which he responds, okay, I'll read the style guide. And of course, with any XKCD, we have to read the alt text. I honestly didn't think you could even use emoji in variable names or that there were so many different crying ones. You can use emoji for CSS class names too, as crazy as that might be. So we've written all this code, but we haven't really explained why we've done the things that we have. I think at this point, as great as ViewSource is, it's not that ViewSource is going away, but ViewSource never really answered the question of why. And thankfully, again, as an industry, we've really seen a shift towards making style guides. This is a fantastic URL to go to if you haven't been there already, styleguides.io. There is a ton of resources here. There's a lot of articles. There's a lot of other existing style guides that are out there. I highly recommend going through and taking a look at what everybody else is doing. Style guides are great because they do allow you to document not only for yourself, not only for the rest of the team, but when you publicize this, you can help explain some of the use cases for this. Again, coming with identifying patterns, when you break down all the different pieces and put everything onto one page, it often makes things really obvious, things that aren't obvious when you look at a given page. You might look at a page and go, yeah, this looks good. I've got a single drop down. I've got a single button. everything looks good. But then when you compile everything together, you realize, why do we have 20 different button styles when really we only need maybe 2, 3, 4 different ones? Why do we have this many different drop-down styles? Why do we use, 30 different font sizes? One of the things that I find as a regular routine that I like to go through is go through and find and so pick one particular piece and work through that particular piece. Pattern Lab, as we've, depending on the talks you've seen today, I've seen a couple times. I love Pattern Lab because it is probably the closest I've seen to the prototyping engine that we had at Yahoo. I really wish that I had a chance to take that and open source it because it was a really useful tool. So once you've actually established these patterns, it also allows you to get into prototyping that much faster because you've got these pieces. The prototyping engine that we had built at Yahoo used Mustache for templates. I like Mustache. I like the simplicity. They call it a logicless template, but it makes it really easy to take data. In this case, we would set up some mock data, create the templates, and we would just compile these templates into the browser. I would use naming convention to associate certain CSS with certain Mustache template files. I would use naming convention to associate JavaScript with each of these things. And so I could load up a particular thing and say, okay, this is a modal dialog, and it would automatically include all the individual pieces for that, including only the CSS needed to style each of those things. No longer did I have this monolithic CSS file. I had essentially my own tiny bootstrap for this project. At Shopify, we've taken the same approach as well. So we've, in this case, actually built our own style guide. It's manually created, for better or for worse. I know there are more automated tools, but at the end of the day, you still need handwritten notes about what this stuff is, what it does, in order to really explain to everybody on the team what these pieces are for. So, at Shopify, we've got regular buttons. We have primary buttons to draw attention to what people should be doing. Destroy, when you click, it's going to be bad. Disabled buttons, slim buttons, large buttons. And, this documentation allows us to identify things that are good and the things that are bad. Now, I mentioned very briefly, and I'm going to go into more detail about auditing. So, once we build something, we end up in this sort of organic process where things slowly get bigger and bigger. We get more edge cases as we go along. And we need to give ourselves time to go back and refactor things. And this is just a given with any growing, ongoing project. Something like my blog where I haven't updated it in 5 years, I kind of lament the loss of that. But with Shopify, with Yahoo, code was changing every single day. People were contributing stuff every single day. And so you end up with this thing that organically kind of grows and then collapses, grows and then collapses. But in order for things to collapse, you need to be able to identify certain things. So what kind of things can we do to identify that? And again, we've seen this URL a number of times today with the web page test. Is a great site to evaluate the performance of your website. How fast are things loading? Are there particular resources? What is our waterfall and how many requests are we making? Do we have opportunities to possibly change from images to SVG? Is an icon font a better approach? Laura's talk and Katie's talk, both of them talked about, having the ability to test your results. This is a very good thing to make sure that the performance gains are there and to definitely test your assumptions. There's been a number of times where I've gone in and thought, this is totally going to be the best way to improve performance for our site. And then once we actually put those numbers in, realizing actually the gains weren't there. You know, breaking up our CSS, for example, into multiple files kind of seemed like a good idea in the sense that like the stuff that people needed 80% of the time would be a lot smaller, but the moment they went to another page that made a second request, then that request kind of negated any of the gains we had of trying to make that CSS file smaller. gzip, for example, the compression gains that you get from repeated CSS rules often sort of offset the performance gains you might have by just having a smaller CSS file to begin with. So one of the things that I like to use is CSS stats. CSS stats is great. You just give it a URL. You can point it to a specific CSS file, and it will spit out an audit of your CSS. This is the Shopify.com homepage. 805 rules, 140K CSS. That is fairly reasonable, I think. You know, are there optimizations we can make? Are there ways to make this better? Sadly, you know, obviously recognizing that there's areas for improvement. The Shopify admin, the area that I work in, I recognize that there are a ton of areas where we can optimize. 5,611 rules. This thing won't even load in IE8. Thankfully, I don't have to support IE8, which is nice. Yeah, things like colors. It will tell you how many unique colors are on that page. Shopify has a palette of 56 colors. Interestingly enough, our CSS file refers to about 160 different CSS colors. So those are areas that we know that we need to bring those things in line. And a lot of that comes from just having a code base that is literally almost a decade old. The CSS has continued to evolve and just had more and more stuff added to it. And so we need to be able to see where we can shorten things up. CSS stats gives you an audit of all the different fonts that you're using. So these are, it's a really handy tool to be able to go through your CSS and identify those things. CSS Dig is another one. CSS Dig is actually a browser extension for Chrome, so highly recommend. And in that, similar to CSS Stats, you know, it provides an audit of properties, things that are being used a lot. Another great tool that I like to use is CSS. It's a CSS redundancy checker. And what it does is it will analyze your CSS and it will identify where it has certain rules that are duplicated, or sorry, certain properties that are duplicated between different rules. So you might have, you know, where you've, you know, maybe had a drop down over here and this contact card over here, and it turns out that they actually use pretty much the same CSS. Maybe this is an area for you to refactor and bring these in line into one object, you know, this one module that you can actually end up reusing. So identifying patterns can be a tricky thing. Sometimes these things aren't obvious from the outset, and a lot of that is because of the fact that we do tend to think in the context of what we're developing. At Shopify, we had this little actions drop-down, and these drop-downs we actually use in a bunch of different places. But then the designer was working on the search input, and the styles that he did for this were very specific to this search box and actually ended up duplicating a lot of code. The class names that he used were search input, search dropdown, search autocomplete. All these things that were very specific to the search because he saw this as one cohesive piece. And coming into this, I looked at it and went, well, you know, based on what we had before, there's a drop shadow, there's blue links. I mean, there's a couple new things. There is the fact that there's an icon on the left and there's now actually like a footer, but we're not really like dramatically changing this thing. And after some discussion, we actually just ended up aligning the two such that now they were exactly the same. So we were able to remove a lot of duplicated code as a result of this process. And again, sometimes that can be a really subtle thing. Again, we have things like these filters. I skipped ahead here. We've got these drop downs for date pickers. Again, you might think, it's a date picker. I'm going to create a date picker, and that date picker is going to have the little fang, it's going to have the drop shadow, it's going to have all this stuff in it. We have this filtering section. We have these contact cards. And it's really easy to fall into this trap that these are all separate things. And so it becomes this great exercise to be able to identify the fact that we really actually have a container. That container is the outside shell. And then we have the contents that go in it. And the contents that go in it are really a separate thing. And so once you kind of get into the habit of looking at pages in this way, you become attuned to seeing these kind of patterns occur over and over and over again. And these become your opportunities to refactor and align things within your project. Now, once you have done these audits, once maybe you've set a performance budget, it's good to keep monitoring in to track things over a period of time. Speed Curve is a great site for doing just that. It will essentially use the web page test stuff under the hood, will give you the film strips, it will give you the waterfalls, and will allow you to track things over time. Personally, at Shopify, our admin code base is in a bit of a shell, so we don't have the same ability to track metrics. So what I do is I actually use CSS stats to generate, essentially once a month I'll go in and do an audit, and I'll compare to where we were before. Are these numbers going up or are these numbers going down? And having these opportunities to do these refactors. Yes, our color count had gotten really high, and we did a couple refactors, and we're able to bring that count down. And so these are really good exercises to go through within your project. So to kind of go over some of the things that I've talked about, one is build modularly. By building these system of components, it makes it easier to identify these patterns. By categorizing the type of CSS that we write, we can see patterns across different types of objects that we're creating. And then once we've categorized things, we want to document that. We want to document that in a style guide. Also known as a pattern library, also known as a UI kit. These are all sort of the same names for the same thing. But these things are very useful tools within an organization. And then once we've done that, what we want to be able to do is identify the outliers. What are those exceptions, and is there a justification for those exceptions? And there very well could be, right? That on a particular project, the designer might say, I really need this because, from a conversion perspective, if that button is 10 pixels smaller, people aren't clicking on it, they're not seeing it. And that might be a decision that, okay, this is the case. But I can guarantee you, what I've often heard designers say is that it's only going to be used in this one place, and yet, once something has been established as a thing, other designers in the team will use it. So it's always important to kind of recognize, once you've put it out there, is it okay for that to eventually get across an entire company? That oftentimes, it's not just, you've solved your own problem by using this in this particular case. Another designer may have the same problem and choose to use your solution in solving that same problem. And then once we've done that, we want to rinse and repeat, right? We start from the beginning, we're going to build modularly, we're going to categorize, we're going to build, document the stuff in our style guide, and then once again, find the outliers and repeat. And hopefully once we've done this, our mission will be accomplished. So with that, thank you very much.